Good evening. I want to thank all of you for coming out in this weather, especially those students who ignored the email from the university about a half an hour ago saying there's a delayed start tomorrow morning, and realizing that that did not mean that this event was canceled tonight. So I want to thank all the students here tonight. This is the 8th Adam Smith Lecture sponsored by the Boise State Economics Department. I am Alan Dalton, Emeritus Faculty in the Department of Economics, and I also organize this lecture. I want to make sure that everybody turns off their cell phones, or at least silences them. At the conclusion of our speaker's presentation, we'll have a Q&A. There are mics in each one of the aisles. Just form a line, and our speaker tonight will just go from mic to mic to mic, answering your questions. Also, at the end of the Q&A tonight, students from the economics department will collect your extra credit slips. If you have to leave before the end of the Q&A, please leave as quietly as possible, but we encourage you to stay at to the end of Q&A. We will try to be done at 7:45, so this will be no longer than your usual class. Funding for tonight's event was provided by donations from local supporters, including Larry and Sharon Johnson. Larry's here tonight. Thank you, Larry. And Deborah Riedel. So let's give them a round of applause. I would also like to thank Dean Mark Bannister of the College of Business and Economics, and Annie Walker, our chair of the Economics Department. Annie, wave. For their ongoing support of this lecture series. The Economics Department has established the Adam Smith Lecture in order to bring to the Boise State campus nationally and internationally recognized scholars who have deepened our understanding of, extended the work of, or show an appreciation of the work of Adam Smith. Adam Smith, the 18th century Scottish moral philosopher, established his reputation with two works, The Theory of Moral Sentiments and The Wealth of Nations, which continue to enlighten and inform us concerning the two spheres of interaction that humans engage in. First, the intimate sphere of personal exchange, typified by friendships, families, and voluntary non-market institutions such as churches and clubs. And second, the impersonal sphere of market exchange, which gives rise to specialization in the division of labor that has produced the wealth we enjoy as citizens of the modern world, well, at least in those nations that have embraced markets and the necessary underlying institutions of the rule of law and private property. It is my great honor to introduce tonight's speaker, one who has eloquently shared our understanding of Smith's economics, politics, and moral philosophy in his classrooms and writing for 57 years. Kenneth G. Elzinga is the Robert C. Taylor Professor of Economics at the University of Virginia. He has received numerous teaching awards, and each fall his introductory economics course attracts over 1,000 students, making it the largest class offered at the University of Virginia. An expert in antitrust economics, he has testified in several precedent-setting antitrust cases, including 4 Supreme Court decisions. The author of more than 100 academic publications, Professor Elzinga also is known for his mystery novels, co-authored with fellow economist William Breit under the pen name Marshall Jevons. Okay, so make sure, Marshall Jevons, not Kenneth Elzinga, when you look these up. At one time, these novels were used in principles classes throughout the nation. I remember when Murder at the Margin first came out, and it was used at the institution I was teaching at then. Those 4 novels are Murder at the Margin, The Fatal Equilibrium, A Deadly Indifference, and The Mystery of the Invisible Hand. They all look at the work of an economist, Henry Spearman, modeled after a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Milton Friedman. And Henry Spearman uses economic analysis to solve the mysteries. A member of the faculty at the University of Virginia since 1967, Elzinga received his BA from Kalamazoo College in Michigan and a PhD from Michigan State University. Tonight's lecture is entitled Adam Smith's Obvious and Simple System of Natural Liberty. Please welcome the 2025 Adam Smith Lecturer, Professor Ken Elzinga.
Thank you, Alan, for a kind introduction. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for braving the snow to be here. I'm going to start my lecture in a very peculiar way and say something that's like a footnote, but I'm afraid I'll forget the footnote by the time I get into the lecture. And this is just for the students here. If you're a talented student and you're interested in law or business or economics, and you're thinking, maybe I'd like to do graduate work on the East Coast, maybe not be around the Rockies, but be around the Blue Ridge Mountains. And you think Charlottesville might be an interesting place to do that, and you're interested in the University of Virginia, I would love to talk to you after the lecture. If you don't have time after the lecture, or I'm being whisked away after the lecture to a dinner engagement, send me an email. This won't surprise you. I'm the only Elzinga on the entire University of Virginia faculty, so you can track me down. And if you want to come to Charlottesville and visit, I will arrange for you to have accommodations for that visit. I would love to see talented students from Boise State University do their graduate work at what we sometimes call Mr. Jefferson's University, because Thomas Jefferson was the founder of the institution where I teach. Okay, that's the footnote that I would otherwise forget. If you've listened to many talks, at least in the United States, you know it's very common for speakers to begin by saying how delighted they are to be here. Now, usually that's a fabrication. That's just made up. Truth be told, the speaker would rather be at the beach or, I don't know, listening to a lecture, or, hiking in a national park, reading a book. But I can really say without dissembling that I'm delighted to be here. Indeed, honored is the word. I'm such a fan of Adam Smith that to give a lecture about Adam Smith for me is an honor. So to set the stage, here's a picture of the person that we're honoring tonight and about whom I'm speaking, at least in a direct, if not indirect way. I have taught principles of economics. My fall teaching course is always a fall introductory course in econ. Micro principles, Econ 201 at UVA, might be 101 here, some sort of number. And over the years, I've taught over 50,000 students in that class. And it's been my privilege to acquaint them year after year after year with some of the principles that have their origin in Adam Smith's remarkable book, An Inquiry into the Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations. It was published in 1776. And it's a book which continues to have relevance today. In the very first day of class, my students learn about the principle of specialization and division of labor, which comes from Smith. And then early on in the semester, my students become acquainted with the economic metaphor of the invisible hand, which also comes from Smith. And then over the course of the whole semester, I hope my students understand the hidden economic logic of how the pursuit of self-interest can promote the common good. And that comes from Smith as well. Now, I don't have any political agenda in teaching economics, but at the end of the semester, I hope my students, whether they agree with it or not, would be able to explain the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. That's a Smithian term. It's a quotation from Smith that's in the title of my lecture. Now, instead of talking first about the obvious and simple system of natural liberty, I'm going to be contrarian and talk about an economic system that is the opposite of the one described by Adam Smith. This economic system goes by a variety of names, but the most common description is socialism. And so to draw the contrast, I'm going to use a teaching device that's often not used in economics. It's telling a story. And this is a story that doesn't begin with a man walks into a bar, but it's a story that begins with a young woman walks into an econ professor's office. And she's a student at the University of Virginia, and the office she enters is mine. And we go through all the basics of getting acquainted, and I learned that her father owns a business that sells plumbing supplies. Her mother's a homemaker. And the student wants to talk to me about careers. Now, so far, there's nothing unusual about the story. Econ professors are magnets for students with questions about careers. And the student tells me she wants to have a career where she can, as she put it, help people. And she asked me about some nonprofit organizations. We talked about them. I've served on several boards, currently serve on 4, and 4 of them have been in the nonprofit sector. So I can talk at length about nonprofit organizations, but I also inquire about her going into the family business, a plumbing supply company that her father owns and operates. And she says no, she isn't interested in joining the family business. Rather, she wants a career where she can help people as opposed to make money. So in my student's mind, she stood at a vocational fork in the road. One career path involved the for-profit sector, the family business, where the operative words, in her view, were the pursuit of money and greed, self-interest. The other career path involved the not-for-profit sector, where the operative words were common good, public service. So if you ask yourself the question, is it more commendable to pursue your self-interest or pursue the common good? That question seems to answer itself. Certainly it did for my student visitor. My student might think of this fork in the road as the private sector versus the public sector, or the not-for-profit sector versus the profit sector. But for purposes of my talk, I'm going to paint with a very broad brush here and consider the fork as capitalism versus socialism. So I'm going to start with socialism, and that is a portmanteau expression that requires some unpacking. And I'm going to do that right now. As a fact of history, socialism has been identified with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics under Joseph Stalin, the National Socialist German Workers' Party under Adolf Hitler, and the British Labour Party under Clement Attlee. Now, I'd like us to pause for a moment and think about that word socialism, which has been identified with these 3 institutions and people: communism in Russia, Nazism in Germany, and the Labour Party in Great Britain, all variations on socialism. So this is an AI-generated picture of Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and Clement Attlee. And they're all wearing a T-shirt that says, "I'm a socialist." And they could all legitimately claim that, and they did. And the question I want to address is, how could this be? Not just because they look differently, but the historical judgment against them is tremendously different across these 3 political leaders. So one way to answer the question is to return to socialism's roots and to inquire of Friedrich Engels, a very close friend and collaborator of Karl Marx. That's these 2 guys here. In 1880, Engels wrote this, and I'm going to put the slide up for you to see. 2 great discoveries: the materialist conception of history and the revelation, notice the kind of theological terminology here, the revelation of the secret of capitalist production through surplus value. We owe that to Marx, these 2 great discoveries. And with these discoveries, or based on these discoveries, we might put it today, based on these discoveries, socialism becomes a science. And the next thing to do is just work out the details and the relations. So according to Marx and Engels, socialism is a science like chemistry and biology. And to put it into practice, the result was going to be the collapse of capitalism. Now, to achieve an economic utopia, and that's what these people were talking about, putting it into practice is what you needed to do. That is, you worked it out through central planning of the economy, as opposed to an economy that is governed by markets. And about 40 years after Engels, the British Labour Party endeavored to work out socialism's details and relations, to use Engels' term. Clause 4 of the party's platform stated this: to secure for the workers, notice not for the capitalists, for the workers, the most equitable distribution possible upon the basis of the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. So production, distribution, exchange, and the best obtainable system of control of each industry or service. That's Clause 4 of the British Labour Party platform. So public ownership of the means of production, as opposed to private property, and the allocation of resources by a central plan, as opposed to market processes, that's the essence of the economic organization of socialism. So we might ask today what's been the result as scientific socialism has worked out the details in places like Germany, Russia, and England. I'm going to walk through some of the predictions of Marx. First, Marx predicted there would be a growing class polarization and the disappearance of the middle class in a market economy. Contrary to Marx, capitalism fostered a middle class. Indeed, the middle class turned out to be the modal socioeconomic class in the Western world. Marx predicted not only the relative, but the absolute impoverishment of the working class. But under capitalism, the number of poor, by any metric, has declined over time. The working class today consumes goods and services in an amount that would be unimaginable to Marx himself. And then Marx predicted the inevitability of the proletarian revolution. And we're still waiting. The U.S. has had demonstrations, but think for a moment about what they have been. The historic demonstrations have been civil rights, abortion, and wars on foreign soil. But to date, there has been no proletarian revolution. And then Marx predicted the inevitable fall of the profit rate, a process that was supposed to ultimately lead to the collapse of the capitalistic economy. The rise of the S&P 500 stock index since its inception is only one indicator of the failure of Marx's forecast. Millions, literally millions of ordinary Americans have enhanced their wealth by investing in the U.S. stock market. And the fifth failure is Marx's prediction that the market system will hamper technical progress. Come again, a mobile device today that all of you were asked to turn off has more computing power than an IBM 360 mainframe computer. Now, for those of you who are young, you have no idea what I'm even talking about, but the main computer that put IBM on the map was the IBM 360, the System 360. And I'm old enough to remember the IBM 360, what a remarkable breakthrough it was for economic research and many other types of research, but it took up a whole room. It took up a whole room. You now carry the equivalent of an IBM 360 in a pocket or a purse. So not one of Marx's predictions about the fall of capitalism and the rise of socialism came true, and apart from a few continuing attempts at socialism in places like North Korea or Cuba or Venezuela, today hardly anyone, at least in the West, even uses the word socialism to mean the political systems of Soviet communism, Nazism, or even the British Labour Party. However, what I call the aspirational agenda of socialism is still with us. An economic system that would function for the common good, that is an aspiration in the minds and hearts of many. Socialism claimed it would end poverty, achieve equality, bring about social harmony for those with what Thomas Sowell calls an unconstrained vision. These are still noble ideals. Now, the sorry track record of central planning and public ownership of the means of production have persuaded many people to restrain their enthusiasm for socialism's original flavor. I like very much the way Gary Saul Morrison put it. He's a great scholar of the Soviet Union in particular. He says, in Western Europe, socialism settled down into social democratic parties of the center left. I want to come back to what's on the screen here. When he was prime minister, Tony Blair called for what he called a market-friendly revision to that clause. And as a result, scientific flavor of socialism has been almost universally rejected, even by the British Labour Party. This notion of an all-encompassing central plan where the state owned the means of production has basically been replaced by a system of government-fostered penalties and rewards and regulations in the forms of taxes, subsidies, and rules. So the current flavor of socialism no longer entails an elaborate apparatus of central planning. We don't hear about 5-year plans anymore or great leaps forward. But what we have instead is a lot of independent regulatory agencies, a lot of them in our country known by their initials, the EPA, the CEA, the DOE, HHS, FCC, FTC, the list goes on. And they're staffed by people who have great authority as to how resources are going to be deployed. What's absent is central ownership, public ownership of the means of production, which was part of the Marx-Engels plan. And what's absent is an all-encompassing central plan. So now we turn to capitalism. And this is a term that carries a lot of baggage. Capitalism, to some people, in sort of a sociological thing, has a definition that kind of means consumerism. It doesn't mean something that I think of it as an economic system. Or it's defined by a particular motivation. Capitalism is the motivation of greed. Or it's often connected, in my students' mind, to a particular form of international relations. Capitalism is something like globalism. Or it's combined with the word democratic, as in democratic capitalism. And while I'm going to use the word capitalism in this talk, I'm really uneasy about the term because so many people identify it with the economic systems of Western Europe and the United States. And so if you identify it that way, you're defining capitalism as a very complex alliance between business, government, and organized labor. And that's not how I'm going to unpack the term capitalism. I want to go back to Adam Smith in this regard, because that's the guy we're here to think about in the context of this lecture. Adam Smith claimed that capitalism was based on a human propensity. Deep in our nature, according to Smith, was what he called a propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. That's the Smith terms. We have innate in us, Smith thought, a propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. Now, when I say that to my students in Econ 201, to them, a truck is a truck. I mean, it's a pickup truck or a dump truck. But to Smith, truck was, in that time in England, to truck was to sell and buy. So to truck, barter, and exchange is all three ways of saying the very same thing, buying and selling. So a necessary condition for capitalism then, in a Smithian world, is you had to have private property. People, if they're going to truck, barter, and exchange, they have to know what's theirs and what somebody else owns so that you can exchange the property rights on that. Now, one of the breakthroughs since Smith is understanding that private property can be tangible. Smith understood that, like a ton of steel or 100 acres of farmland, but it can also be intangible, what economists have come to call human capital, a skill to repair an air conditioner or manage a brew pub. And rather than a central plan that determines what goods and services are produced and how they're going to be produced and for whom, capitalism determines these by market forces of consumer demand, seller supply, drawing scarce resources into some uses and pushing them out from others. So capitalism in its economic sense, I think, is best called a market system, or as we frequently do in econ, a price system, because markets tend to be associated with prices. But Adam Smith referred to it as a obvious and simple system of natural liberty. Now, speaking of Adam Smith, his counsel to the young woman in my office, remember her at the start of the lecture? It would be based upon something that's a mystery to many people. Smith called this mystery the invisible hand. And using this metaphor, Smith claimed that by the workings of an invisible hand, the common good can be approximated when people pursue their self-interest. And how can that be? That's part of the challenge of teaching microeconomics. Now here's one way to think about Smith's metaphor of the invisible hand. If we thought that our supply of toothpaste or orange juice was running low, or we realized I need to get a pair of tweezers, or I need a USB charging cord, none of us in this room attending this lecture would lose any sleep tonight worrying about how are these items going to be available to us. We would all slumber peacefully because we attach such a high probability these items will be sitting on shelves at brick and mortar stores, or they're going to be available to us online when we get up. But think about this for a moment. Right now, there are thousands, literally thousands of goods and services being produced. They're being transported to Boise, Idaho, and they're going to arrive here not because it's traditional, that there are a group of families that for years and generations have been doing that, not because there's any central authority that has decreed they're supposed to get here. They're going to arrive here because some individuals decided to pursue their rational self-interest, and for that reason they will arrive. They will not arrive because individuals have decided to pursue the common good to make this happen. And I tell my students the most famous metaphor in all of the social sciences comes from a Scotsman named Adam Smith, and it's the invisible hand. What could that mean? Smith claimed to show how people could act in their rational self-interest and as if by an invisible hand promote the public interest. Now, one of the weird hobbies I have is collecting writings where the invisible hand appears. And some of my students have picked up on that, and they'll send me an email or they'll stop by my office and say, Mr. Elzinga, I found an example of the invisible hand, not as an economic metaphor. So here's a few places where you can find the invisible hand. You can find it in the Count of Monte Cristo. We've been guided by an invisible hand. You can find it in Mary Shelley's book, Frankenstein. You can find it in Macbeth. Use your bloody and invisible hand to tear up Banquo's lease on life. You can find it in one of my favorite authors, Flannery O'Connor, referring to an invisible hand. You can find it in Nietzsche. You can find it in Joseph Conrad. If you're interested in magic, I have sort of a nominal interest in magic. There's actually a magic trick you can buy called the invisible hand. It even shows up, and to me this is the most interesting, of all the various places I've found the invisible hand outside of Smith, it's in the inaugural address of George Washington as the first president of the United States. And he said this: "No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States." I don't pretend to understand exactly what that meant, but it seems to suggest that George Washington believed there was a providential invisible hand at work in the founding of the United States, a providential agency, so to speak. Now, Adam Smith's most famous illustration of the invisible hand is in this quote: "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the baker, or the brewer that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest." So said differently, for you and me to consume food and drink, we do not appeal to the good nature of those who make food and drink. We don't appeal to their sympathy. We don't appeal to their compassion. We don't even appeal to their desire to help other people in order to persuade them to put food and drink on our table. Smith, in talking about the invisible hand, said that we appeal to their self-interest. And in the process, we will get food and drink, and we'll get toothpaste, and we'll get tweezers, and we'll get USB charging cords. Because for a business to succeed over the long run, it's got to be other regarding in its actions. So let me return one last time to the young woman who came to my office, whose family owns the plumbing supply business. Now, this firm, as probably most of you would gather, buys plumbing supplies from a manufacturer, shoulders the cost of holding these things in inventory, hoping that some customers are going to decide to purchase them on terms that will sustain the operation of the family, of the firm, and allow the family to be able to be provided for. And so you have to ask yourself the question, or I do, how can such an organization ever be construed as an instrument of injustice or oppression, as some people characterize the business world? I can understand how withholding plumbing supplies could be unjust, but supplying them to willing and informed buyers, to my mind, simply cannot be unjust. That's why in the case of voluntary exchange between informed buyers and informed sellers, the seller and the buyer each can say thank you when the transaction is consummated. This is what economists call gains from trade. And the remarkable, and it is remarkable, implication of Adam Smith's invisible hand is that the student who walked into my office might help people more, or to put it a little differently, help more people if upon graduation she ran the family plumbing supply business at a profit rather than doing something with the express purpose of helping people for the common good. What economists call a positive sum game is played when people trade, when people innovate, when people exchange labor services for wages. Both sides of the transaction can be better off. It's the hidden economic logic that goes back to Adam Smith that makes this point. But the logic is really hidden to me. People to those, especially to those who want to do good, but simply cannot imagine that could be associated with doing well. So the young woman who came into my office was not a statistical outlier. Many of my students at the University of Virginia are attracted to the nonprofit sector, and one reason might be because the nonprofit sector just sounds more winsome and congenial than for profit. You say to someone, I'm going to provide this good or service to you, and I'm going to make a profit in doing so. Now compare that to, I'm going to provide this good or service to you, and I'm not going to add a profit that I'll keep for myself. The rhetorical tilt of these is pretty obvious. They differ. But here's an example of why economists are rarely the life of the party. For us, as a matter of language, it's more meaningful to describe the nonprofit sector as the non-tax sector. One could say, I'm going to provide this good or service to you, and instead of saying I'm doing it for the common good, could say, I don't have to pay any taxes in doing so. Versus you say to someone, I'm going to provide this good or service to you, and in doing so, I'm going to support the local, state, and federal government by paying my share of taxes so that we can have a fire department and fix the roads and have an air force to protect us from enemies. Econ analysis, and this is always a new insight to my students, really does not draw a major distinction between those who are employed in the profit sector and those who are employed in the nonprofit sector. We basically apply a rational actor model in both. People in both sectors pursue their self-interest as they perceive it. A very key distinction is that one sector pays taxes and the other one does not. So for those who take a lot of pride or psychic income from employment in the nonprofit sector, thinking like an economist will reduce their psychic income by pointing out they simply work in the non-tax sector. Small wonder that so many people who work in the non-tax sector support higher corporate tax rates. That's in their rational self-interest. It means their sector won't have to pay up. Okay, I want to switch gears slightly here. I spoke earlier of the roots of socialism in Marx and Engels. Marx and Engels and all like-minded scribes and politicians envision a world that was just going to be free of nature's tooth and claw. A world of communal sharing rather than individual competition, a world of abundance and not scarcity, and with very few exceptions, a world without an intervening or demanding God. And I've wondered if there's some behavioral trait or DNA that characterizes intellectuals and those who function in what economists call the public sector. Don Boudreaux, an economist who took a law degree at the University of Virginia, thinks there might be. He talks about the intellectual bias is always against recognizing that the world can work very peacefully and productively without the intellectual's blueprint for society. And Smith recognized early on, back in 1776, the fallacy of those who would presume to be able to control others and pull it off. This is a long quote from Smith, and I know there's always a danger in public speaking to inflict a long quote, but I'd like you to pay attention to this. And I'm just inserting the word central planner. Smith used a different term for that. The central planner seems to imagine that he can arrange the different members of a great society. That's interesting that Smith used that word, great society, back in 1776, with as much ease as the hand arranges the different pieces on a chessboard. He, the central planner, does not consider that the pieces on the chessboard have no other principle of motion besides that which the hand impresses upon. But that in the great chessboard of human society, that is, when it comes to arranging people, every single piece has a principle of motion of its own, altogether different from that which the legislature might choose to impress upon it. Very early, for those of you who have read Hayek, very early language that is very Hayekian in its terminology. Okay, then what value is socialism? Well, as an economic arrangement, it didn't live up to its billing. Scientific socialism was defective simply because central planning does not work. Regulatory socialism, the administrative state, as some people call it, has its own internal problems. Economists would call it a principal agent problem, the problem of regulatory capture, the problem of rent seeking. And the science of socialism leaves those fundamental questions unanswered. The question is, why should those who engage in planning our lives know what is better for us than we ourselves? So when Smith published The Wealth of Nations, the experience of most people over the whole span of human existence was one of grinding, hopeless poverty. Poverty that had no prospect of relief, no expectation of improvement, and Smith wanted to explore the aberrations. How did some nations manage to escape this? That's why the full title of the book is an inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. Why are these anomalies here when across the whole scope of human existence it was grinding, relentless poverty? Have you ever heard the question, what's in a name? What about the name Adam Smith? How fitting is that? So Adam is the name of the first man, and that gets paired with Smith, which is the most common surname in the English language. So the Bible tells us that God put a man named Adam in a garden that he might flourish. And that episode didn't go so well. And we know that wealth from the time of Adam and Eve was the province of royalty, potentates, religious, military leaders. Poverty was the plight of almost everybody else. But after countless generations and centuries of hardship, along came another man with the name Adam, who wrote a book. And it's a book that tells us how even the Smiths of the world, that is the ordinary people, the little guys, might flourish and enjoy goods and services that leaders of old could not even imagine consuming. Now, at this point in my lecture, let me engage in what lawyers call a sidebar conversation about the potential pitfalls of capitalism. Let's grant that capitalism outperforms socialism in terms of delivering goods and services, in terms of the rate of technological progress. The market system beats central planning in terms of delivering more goods, more food, more shelter to ordinary people. But in capitalism's abundance, should we be concerned that if in the process of producing more goods and services, people are likely to become more covetous and greedier than they would otherwise be? That is, if capitalism enables us to have more goods and services, as a consequence, does capitalism cause us to lose our souls? There's a reason to raise this concern. That is, does an economic system that is absolutely amazing at churning out goods and services, which is motivated by people primarily pursuing their self-interest, does it make people more covetous? Perhaps, but I'm not persuaded that the blame for covetousness can be laid at the feet of capitalism. Wanting more has been around long before the modern market economy. The Ten Commandments, after all, have a do not covet prohibition. Now, a related question that comes up a lot in my teaching undergraduates is that if capitalism is based on greed, isn't greed bad? I want to address that briefly, but take the question very seriously. Greed is bad. That is, in my view, greed deserves to be among the 7 deadly sins. Contrary to what corporate raider Gordon Gekko said in a motion picture called Wall Street, greed is not good, and economics does not contend that it is. Economics teaches something else. What economics teaches is that if buyers and sellers have tradable property rights over tangible and intangible assets that they own, and buyers and sellers have information about the assets that are up for sale, and they pursue their self-interest in a market economy, they can improve the economic welfare of the system by making voluntary transactions between them, and that's it. Both parties can be made better off. If I buy a big box of Cheerios at Costco, I'm better off, and Costco is better off. The jargon of econ, there are gains from trade. One could, I suppose, describe the desire of a business owner under capitalism to have profits as greed. But if you did that, I think it's a fair use of the word to apply it to politicians as well in their administrative system. That politicians crave power is undeniable, just as it's undeniable that business people crave profits. So if you look at political history before the rise of democracy, we see virtually nothing other than dictators struggling to cement their power internally and expand their power externally. The enduring problem of socialism with any form of central planning is to incentivize power-hungry officials to operate in the needs and interests of citizens, just as the enduring problem of capitalism is to incentivize business firms to operate in the interests of consumers and employees. Now, this is a lecture, not a class. There won't be any tests. But this lecture, without having a test, does have a reading list of sorts. I'm going to put on the screen some periodicals. If what I've said about capitalism comes off in a positive way, and you want to test your free market conditions, then take a look at these 2 magazines, The American Prospect, which is a periodical that defines itself as the case for pragmatic socialism. And if you think you'd benefit from reading a pro-socialist journal that is not just pragmatic like The American Prospect, but has a real bite to it, then read Jacobin, which describes itself as believing in the decommodification of the whole economy. And then if what I've said about socialism strikes you as really positive and you want to test your affection for the administrative state, then you ought to read these 2 journals, The Independent Review, published by the Independent Institute, and Free Society, published by Cato. Or if you're ambitious, you can do what I do, and that is subscribe and read all 4. Okay, let me come back to Adam Smith one last time. I want to mention, while he's a hero of mine as an economist, my hero in the humanities is an English professor, a former English professor from England named C.S. Lewis. As far as I know, Lewis never read The Wealth of Nations, but like Adam Smith, he was very skeptical of central planning. He didn't expect anyone who purportedly was employed to promote the public good under socialism would be any better, be any more beneficent, any more altruistic than people who pursued their self-interest in the private sector. In fact, Lewis worried that the people in the public sector would be even worse in their fallen human nature than people in the private sector. Here's a picture of Lewis and something that he wrote, talking about socialism in England. All that can really happen under socialism is that some men will take charge of the destiny of others. They will be simply men, none perfect, some greedy, cruel, and dishonest. The more completely we are planned, the more powerful they will be. Have we discovered some new reason why this time power should not corrupt as it had done before? Now, one way capitalism incentivizes business firms to operate in the interests of consumers is by business firms having to compete for the patronage of consumers. And does that happen? This is kind of a tongue-in-cheek expression. I realize that, it's sort of tongue-in-cheek. But think about comparing capitalism with socialism in what Germans call a Gedanken experiment. A Gedanken experiment is something that doesn't require a laboratory. You just do it in your head. You just use your brain. So imagine the difference between the greeting that you get when you enter Chick-fil-A or a Nike outlet versus the greeting you get, at least in Virginia, when you enter an office of the IRS or the Division of Motor Vehicles. Upon entering Chick-fil-A or a Nike outlet store, you're likely to be asked, "How can I help you? How can I help you?" Upon entering the IRS or the DMV, maybe it's different here in Idaho, but in Virginia, you're likely to be told, "Take a seat. Just take a seat over there. I'll be with you when I get to you." Now, there's something really important to understand about this that very few people outside of economics get, but we get that. That example, somewhat contrived, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but somewhat realistic, that example doesn't occur because bad people are attracted to work at the DMV and really empathetic, nice people work at Chick-fil-A and Nike. That is not the view of the economists. The economists would be very comfortable with saying both of these people are the same, and if you translated where they were employed, you'd get the very same result because the incentives differ. It's not that the human nature differs, it's the incentive differs. If I work at Chick-fil-A or Nike, and I'm an employee, whether I'm a manager or on the sales floor, to help people helps me get a better job, helps me keep my job, helps me get wages, helps me get promoted. That's the incentive. But if you're over at the very same person working for the DMV or at the IRS, you don't have the same incentive structure. Being nice to people may be something you do, but you're not incentivized by the organization to do that. There's no way you can really capture the gains in the public sector from that type of behavior. Now, at this point in the Adam Smith lecture, I want to say something about when I was a student at Kalamazoo College. I took a class in public speaking, Speech 201, and my teacher was a professor named Nelda Balch. I still remember Professor Nelda Balch, and she told me that whenever I give a speech, I should let the audience know when I was getting near the end. Now, she didn't tell my classmates that, and I asked her why. And she told me, "Kenny," I was called Kenny back when I was in Michigan, she said, "Kenny, if you let them know you're close to finishing, this will revive hope among your audience." So I'm getting near the end. And I want to do a sidebar conversation as I close. The sidebar is again, what lawyers refer to, and it's a sidebar conversation about the Bible. I know many people who think the Bible is an inspired book. That is, it's revelation from God. But most of the people I hang around with in the academy don't think it's supernaturally inspired, but a lot of them would think it's a really important book in terms of Western literature and Western culture. I'm someone who believes you can learn a lot of economics from the Bible. And when scholars write about Adam Smith's life, they usually point to his acquaintance with David Hume. He was a very close friend of David Hume's. They must have been amazing intellectual conversations with each other. And Hume was known to be probably the most prominent and persuasive atheist at the time. And people sometimes think, well, they were so close, Smith probably was an atheist. And that's just not true. That is not true. Smith expressed great admiration for Presbyterian ministers in his day. Now, a Presbyterian minister in his day was quite different than a Presbyterian minister in his day, different from today, in that they were real scholars. They were known as scholars. So in The Wealth of Nations, Smith writes this: "There is scarce perhaps to be found anywhere in Europe a more learned, decent, independent, and respectable set of men than the greater part of the Presbyterian clergy of Holland, Geneva, Switzerland, and Scotland." An amazing statement. Look around the world. Who are these people that he admires? Presbyterian clergy in Holland, Geneva, Switzerland, and Scotland. Smith himself was a student of Francis Hutcheson, who was both, it's hard for us to imagine this today, a minister in the Church of Scotland and a professor at the University of Glasgow. And it's in this grain, this Smithian grain, that I'm going to introduce a Bible story that I think would have met with Smith's approval. It's a story that shows up in the life of Jesus when Jesus was asked, how do you define a neighbor? What is a neighbor? And Jesus responds with a very brief story, and it's usually called the parable of the Good Samaritan. You may know the story. It involves a man, implicitly a Jewish man, who's traveling along on a road, and this poor guy is set upon by robbers. They take his belongings, and if that isn't enough, they beat him up, and they leave him half dead alongside the road. And in this parable, two religious Jews come by, and instead of going over to help, in the parable, Jesus said they just pass by. They just ignore this poor guy. And then what makes the parable remarkable, maybe even astonishing if you were to hear it at that time, is that a Samaritan comes along, someone who's not a Jew, someone who's from a people group that was looked down upon by many Jews, and it's he, the Samaritan, who treats the wounds of the man who'd been beaten and robbed. And the Samaritan is not only sympathetic to the guy's plight, he takes him, according to the parable, to a place of shelter, and then he pays for his care. So to be compassionate to those in need in the conventional interpretation of the parable of the Good Samaritan, that's the economics of the story. I think if Smith read this parable, and there's no doubt that he did, instead of calling it the parable of the Good Samaritan, Smith would have called it the parable of the well-to-do Samaritan, or maybe the Samaritan who has a lot of money in his pocket. Because if the Samaritan didn't have any wealth, he couldn't have helped this poor man the way he did. And my point is, neighborly love requires compassion, to be sure, but the implication of the parable is that the Good Samaritan's love also required economic capacity in order to exercise it. That is, the Samaritan had to have resources in the form of income or wealth in order to provide for the poor guy who was beaten and robbed. So an econ formulation of love might look something like this, very low-level math. Love is compassion plus economic capacity. If you just have capacity without compassion, you're left with selfishness. On the other hand, compassion without capacity is just frustration. It may be better to give than to receive, but you've got to have something to give. And I think what this parable has to do with capitalism and socialism is that, as Smith revealed in The Wealth of Nations, capitalism has a track record of increasing capacity. The average individual under capitalism now has more resources to give away, to be a good Samaritan. So the Bible distinguishes self-interest from selfishness. One of the most compelling passages from the Apostle Paul, he says, look, each of you, not only to his own interests, but to the interests of others. In other words, the Apostle Paul presumes that you and I are going to look to our own interests. He's assuming that. That is human nature. The verse is, look each of you not only to his own interests, but to the interests of others. And much of economics, from Adam Smith on, is modeling that first part of the verse. What is self-interest like? What does the pursuit of rational self-interest lead to under different institutional arrangements? And Adam Smith helps us understand the conditions wherein people looking to their own interests can promote the well-being of others. The Apostle Paul comes along and says, well, don't do just that. Look also to the interests of others. And to my mind, one of the most remarkable connections between Adam Smith and looking after the interests of others is how the market system has enabled so many people to escape poverty so that they have the capacity now to be a good Samaritan. They have the resources that they can give away and to share and use to help others. All right, thank you for the honor of inviting me to your university to share these thoughts about the founder of economics. I understand we may have an opportunity for Q&A. Professors love to profess, so I'll quit professing by lecture and be happy to turn to Q&A if you have some. Thank you very much.
So if you'd like to ask a question, just go to one of the mics in each one of the aisles.
Good evening.
You're going to have to forgive me. I didn't write down my question, and I'm a little nervous.
Can you speak right into the mic so I can hear you?
Is this good?
Yeah, or just pull it up. There you go.
That good? Okay, cool. My question is about what seems to be a failure of our market system we have right now, which is that when we have a good with inelastic demand and no competition, it seems we get a super high price, like, for example, in the biotech industry. I think this seems to be a product of our IP laws. A lot of countries, like in Europe, seem to be resorting to price controls to try and bring down prices and alleviate the cost for consumers who are in need of dire medical care. My question is, in the spirit of keeping to like a Smithian solution, is there a way that we could reform IP in a way that would help alleviate prices for consumers without heavily discouraging potentially life-saving biomedical research and development?
Sure. Yeah, the question is a very profound one. What happens in a system where people have very few substitutes, they face inelastic demands, pharmaceutical products or medical care is usually the best teaching example that I think of when I want to teach inelastic demand. There are other examples, but the healthcare sector is a huge sector. It is rent with difficult, maybe even intractable problems. What do you do? What does economics bring to the table? Well, it's very much in my field because my specialty in economics is antitrust economics. So I've devoted much of my career, both in terms of government service, consulting, teaching, writing articles, as to how do you make markets competitive so that in private sector, in effect, the seller can't say, take a seat, and that's a metaphor for pay the price that I want to charge you, because I envision markets when they work well is customers have alternatives, that is competition. It doesn't have to be perfect competition. That's a wonderful model to understand certain properties of what competition under very rigorous conditions would look like, but I tend to like the term workable competition. What can we do through the institution of antitrust, taxation, and other vehicles so that when you go to the marketplace, whether it's for ready-to-eat cereal or antidepressants, that you have a choice, and the choice results in driving prices down towards some competitive level. Now, by competitive level, I don't necessarily mean marginal cost. It has to be a competitive level that will sustain and reward, in the case of a pharmaceutical firm, the millions of dollars of spent on R&D. Those fixed costs also have to be paid for. What economics teaches, I think, is that let's simply try to depress that price through a price control, which is sort of the first thing that comes to mind. This is a high price. Let's have a law that depresses it. The problem with that is you have a classic distribution problem. If the supply doesn't match that, you have some other type of non-market allocation. And that gets very messy. We know from history that when markets are not allowed to allocate, when people can't compete by price, then you will have allocation by sellers' preferences. So I'm the seller. I cannot raise the price, so I get to, in effect, pick my customers. And I may pick people based on, do they look like me? Are they of my tribe? Are they of my race? Are they of my religion? Are they of my family? And one of the great things to help poor people who don't have connections is markets are essentially impersonal. And so the seller, where there's no incentive for allocation by sellers' preferences, then people who are underrepresented, marginalized, frequently can get goods and services. Your question reminds me of something that I haven't thought of for years, but I grew up in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and at a time, years ago, when the city was not racially segregated in the way the South was. The schools I went to were integrated. I had African-American kids in my high school. I went to Kalamazoo Central High School. It's where everybody who wasn't rich enough to go to a private school went. So that was a real mixture. But in a way that I never understood, real estate was somewhat segregated through zoning and where people could buy a house. And one of the African-American kids that I got to know, Veach Harrington, said, you know, in Kalamazoo, if you're a black family and you're rich, you can get a Cadillac, but you can't live in that neighborhood. And I didn't understand that at all, but I realize now is the owner of the Cadillac business in town may not have liked life for Americans. I don't know, may have been a bigot. but liked the profit that could be made by selling to anyone. Whereas the housing market was divided and operated under a different system of constraints. So basically, while there's all kinds of monopoly problems, and I've spent most of my career trying to wrestle with them, and so have other people, and for the most part, I think we've done a good job. Cartels, for example, in the United States, which were common in Europe, they're per se illegal. Get together with your rivals and collude on a price, you're likely, if you get caught, you're going to end up in jail. The tougher problems are the natural monopolies, where there's just extensive economies of scale. And what do you do with that? Do you regulate? Do you wait it out? Do you have some other form of a bidding for the right to be the monopolist in that? That's something that econ has teased around and worked with a bit. But I think the bottom line answer, and I'll quit rambling at this point, is to just realize that we live in a world of scarcity. And so we struggle and we work and we think and we do research and we think hard about a problem. What is a system of allocation where not everybody can get everything? If you come into the world with what Tom Sowell called an unconstrained vision, that somehow everybody should be able to get everything at a fair price, well, you're going to be frustrated in life. Better to come into the world with, wow, we have trade-offs, and I want to get involved in the hard work of figuring out how to optimize these trade-offs. Thanks for your question. Over here.
Yeah, I just want to say first, thank you so much for speaking. I really, really enjoyed what you said, and I 100% agree. So my question is kind of about corporatism. So I know I think we can almost view it as like as a pendulum. So like on one far side we have like communism and socialism, and then in the middle I think that's like democratic like capitalism. But I think on the very far side of that is corporatism. So
is what?
Is corporatism. Mm-hmm. So I just want to ask you just like, what are your views on corporatism, and what are some ways we can prevent it? So just for example, like pharmaceutical companies, like we can't even really negotiate drug prices. And I feel like that's not really what Adam Smith envisioned when he was, creating capitalism, where it's about free market, it's about free trade, and it's about individual pursuit of liberty and success. So I just want to say, again, thank you, and I just want to hope you can explain it a little better than probably how I did it.
Yeah, so we had two questions related, essentially, come up through the distribution and allocation of health care. And, I think in some sense, my generation of economists have wrestled with that. We've made important contributions, but your generation is ultimately going to be the one that, if it gets solved. This is one way to think about healthcare through a kind of economic model. It's a sort of a narrative, and I find it helpful. Some of my students have found it helpful. I'll share it with the audience. Imagine that I go to a Chinese restaurant in a normal market economy, and I look at the menu, and there's certain things I like to have, but I'm tempered by my choice by how much certain things cost. The thing I might really like to have is the most expensive item, but it's the most expensive, and I have limited resources, and I settle for something else that optimizes my choice on a price-quality basis. And I'm incentivized to do that because I'm paying for it myself, but I'm also enjoying it myself. So on the one side, I'm incentivized to get something that I want. I'm incentivized to be prudent in my resource use to do that. Now imagine a different scene where I go into the Chinese restaurant, I have two people with me, and I'm thinking of my favorite Chinese restaurant in Charlottesville. So Faye comes up and seats me and notices I'm with two other people and comes up to take the order. And I say to Faye, I'm not ordering today. Usually I order, but this person on my left is going to order. And the person on the left is, in my example, a physician. And so I have no say over the order. The person here says, this is what Ken is going to have for dinner. This is what Ken needs, so to speak. And so that's what I'm served. Somebody else has made the choice. It's not my choice. And I do that for the obvious reason that presumably this physician knows more of what I need than I know myself. So it takes it out of a normal market transaction. But what really makes it complicated is this third person at the table. This is where it really gets messy, because the third person, when Faye comes up with the bill, says, Ken, do you get the bill? No. The person ordered to get the bill? No, this person here gets the bill. Who is this person? It's an insurance company. or some organization that I am into, a health plan. Each of these individuals, each of these economic agents is subject to a peculiar set of incentives. I want the very best medicine I can get if I'm not paying for it. And I may want to go and have a doctor's checkup every quarter and see the best physicians and be sent to Mayo Clinic all the time, leave Charlottesville and go up to Minnesota or go to MD Anderson or whatever if I think I have cancer. I want the very best because I'm not paying for it. I don't have to make that choice calculus. The physician, well, it's really interesting to think, how is this person going to be compensated? The person may be in an organization that says, we get the most out of you if you see Ken for 15 minutes, and that's it. And Ken's out the door, and you have another patient in there in 15 minutes. Or you could have a different incentive structure where the physician gets incentivized by choosing a particular good medicine for me than another, because that's what the PBM has paid for. And then over here in the insurance company, with their incentive, is a peculiar one. At one level, at first glance, is to pay as little as possible for Ken's care. So Ken wants this. Well, I'm going to deny that because it costs $100,000. But it's even more complicated than that for the insurance company. If they think I'm going to be around for a while, they may want to have me get healthy so I don't get something worse that's going to become even more costly to them. But fundamentally, it's not so much my health. And they have to survive as an enterprise. They have to make a profit, a buck, so to speak. The doctor's got to be incentivized to go into that line of work, which involves years of training. And then I'm sitting over here, and I want to go to the Mayo Clinic, and I want to see the best doctor in town. And if you can come up with a solution to that, well, not only will you get a Nobel Prize in economics, if you can figure out how to tease out the optimal incentive structure, but millions and millions of us would be grateful to you. It is a very hard problem to solve. Now, people are doing serious research and analytics about it. What is a problem is you have many, many people who know nothing about economics or don't think about this complex incentive structure, and they basically have this unconstrained vision that everybody should get the best medical care at zero price. And if you do that, you will end up with very poor medical care, and you'll have people waiting a long time for that. That's, I was a visiting scholar in Cambridge at one time. It was a wonderful academic and social experience for me. And while I was there, I was under the National Health Service. And my wife had a medical problem, and we paid zero price for it, which is a very attractive price to pay, but you wait a long time. You don't just call your family doctor and say, oh, can I come in and see you? I've got this problem. And in England right now, people are waiting disturbingly long times to have critical needs met. And it's starting to happen in Canada, which used to pride itself on both low prices and quick delivery. But it takes an enormous amount of resources, and then you have people gaming the system if they're not paying for it themselves. So we need something that incentivizes people, patients, to economize. Part of the genius of that came from an economist. It's the copay arrangement. The fact that I need a certain medicine regularly, and I have to pay $10 for that, seemed like a modest amount, but it keeps me from oversubscribing to that. It keeps me from, I'm careful with the pills that they don't all fall down the drain when I take them out, because I don't want to pay that extra $10. So copay, having, in other words, what people say, having some skin in the game is really important in the delivery of medical care. On the area of pharmaceuticals, well, I was an investor in a pharmaceutical company started by two professors at the University of Virginia. And I learned a lot about that process. And a lot of sweat and equity and money went into developing a product that we hoped would help people with a certain type of cancer. And for about 2 years, it looked like we were making good progress. And then we got into human testing with the FDA, which was very expensive, and it all failed. It didn't work. It didn't work. So there was about, not my money, some of my money, but probably $25 million was lost. And the interesting thing is, it's lost to the investors, but it had a huge social good, because now people knew that if you're going to try this type of cancer, this did not work. So these people who lost $25 million contributed by the loss but they didn't get any gain. The only way you're going to, and this is no reason, it's not a surprise that almost all of the medical breakthroughs in pharmaceuticals come from the United States. It's because we have intellectual property and we have an amazing venture capital market system that people are willing to run the risk of putting up hundreds of millions of dollars with the prospect that there will be no return whatsoever. So to get people to do that, there's got to be some what are called in the pharmaceutical industry billion-dollar drugs. And the problem with the billion-dollar drugs is people look at that and they think, wow, they're making a ton of money. And what they don't see are the hundreds of millions of dollars that investors lost that not only were losses for them, but contributed to the health of the economy, to the health of patients, because we learned what didn't work. Okay, thanks for your question. It is one that we will wrestle with, and I hope your generation gets it solved. Question over here.
Hi, great lecture, thanks. Since we're kind of focusing on healthcare, I'm curious.
I'm really getting an echo. I tell you what, why don't you come right over here and ask the question, and I'll repeat it for the audience, because I won't get the echo without the mic.
Since we're focusing on healthcare, can you comment on the role of private equity companies moving into the healthcare sector and kind of dismantling? It doesn't seem to be working, and your thoughts on that,
Yeah.
or if that's a good solution to the problem.
Yeah, so the question is, what about the VCs, the venture capitalists who go into healthcare? Well, you know, what they're seeking is a monetary return. I mean, the VCs, I've worked with some of them, they are as financially driven as any people that I have mentioned. And so they're placing bets where they think there will be a productive result from R&D. We had some place bets on this little company I was involved in Charlottesville. I don't think they're dismantling anything that I know of. They have no incentive to put their money where there might not be a high reward in terms of a breakthrough and you get a billion-dollar drug. The billion-dollar drugs, again, people look at that and think, wow, these people are really rich. But, you know, I wouldn't be giving this lecture today. I would be dead. They're very clear. The diseases that I've had, I'd be dead if it hadn't been for a billion-dollar drug. I wouldn't be here.
Let me clarify. Private equity moving into hospital management.
Oh, thank you so much. Sure. Sorry, I misunderstood.
Yeah.
Private equity moving into hospital management. Oh my, I have to be really careful to constrain myself. I've spent a lot of time in the antitrust world working in the problem of hospital mergers. And there has been a huge consolidation of hospitals, and the general consensus of not just my personal opinion, but of those who have looked at the hospital merger environment and the track record is that these hospital mergers, in most cases, have been harmful to patients. They've reduced competition in hospitals. They not only have caused prices to go up, that they've reduced the quality of the service in some of these hospitals. And a lot of the health guys that I work with, the health economists who are antitrusters, there's a real sadness that, I don't mean like weeping type sadness, but a professional sadness that some of the warnings that we had given about this weren't heeded by the Federal Trade Commission. Actually, that's unfair. The Federal Trade Commission, I think, got it, but a lot of the courts, with mergers that were challenged by the FTC, the courts had a view that, well, you look at a hospital merger, sort of like a merger of ready-to-eat cereal companies, and we'll kind of put them in the same bin with regard to structural characteristics and barriers to entry. Barriers to entry is really different in hospitals than it is starting a ready-to-eat cereal company. It's not easy if you and I wanted to start a new cereal company to go up against Kellogg's or Post, but there is not a whole host of regulations where you have to go in and prove to some government authority that there's a need for a new hospital. That's very different in the market for hospitals. You have to sometimes persuade a local regulatory body that there's demand. And of course, the existing hospitals come in and say, we're meeting all the demand. Whereas the genius of a pure market system is you don't have to prove to somebody that there's a demand. You take the risk of going in and trying to meet a demand that you think is there. So I think what you may find, certainly right now, there is a much stricter rule about hospital mergers. The economic evidence has persuaded the antitrust authorities that they need to be tougher on hospital mergers. The problem, and it's not an intractable one, but it's a serious one, is to how do you go back and undo those hospital mergers that have caused a degradation in quality at the margin, that have caused an increase in price at the margin. Unscrambling the omelet is very, very difficult in the case of hospitals, difficult in the case of any type of many types of mergers, but it's difficult in the case of hospitals. It may be that there will be technological innovations in healthcare delivery from AI and so on that we can't imagine right now that will start to undo the consequences of when the managements of hospitals seem to be a game for financiers. There's an old economist that I still admire. He was an institutionalist, and I'm really a price theory guy, but I think there's a lot to learn from Thorstein Veblen. Veblen was what we call an institutionalist. And Veblen used to think the real problem with capitalism was what he called its ceremonial role. And he would have looked at people like the people in Silicon Valley as having this ceremonial role. The people who really did good in the economy were the engineers, the people who were on the production line, the people who were selling the goods and getting the goods and services out. And somewhere capitalism had this ceremonial role, the financiers. And he thought the trouble with capitalism is these guys made more money than anybody else, and their role was essentially ceremonial. He would have had a field day with the current Silicon Valley crowd.
I promised that we'd be done in an hour and 15 minutes. We've got a couple minutes over that. Let's get a round of applause. Drop off your extra credit slips. There's a box near the exit. If you want to go to UVA, come up to talk to Dan. Otherwise, we're taking him to dinner.